Hello, and welcome to All Things Disability, a podcast from Northeast ARC. I'm Tim Brown, Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer at Northeast ARC. And today we have a very special guest for our first podcast of 2026. Barbara Remon is a true superhero of our movement. Barbara joined the Northeast ARC family in 1957 when her son Mark was born. She brings a unique perspective to our conversation, that of a mother, a volunteer leader, and board president, as well as a professional who worked at the Hogan Regional Center. Barbara's contributions have been recognized over the years by the ARC with the Edward O'Keefe Award and the Volunteer of the Year Award, and by the Town of Danvers with the Baron Meyer Award. Barbara has also been one of my personal mentors throughout my career, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to help share a part of her story. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
We've known each other now for quite some time.
Absolutely.
My career started at the Northeast ARC 35 years ago in day services. And even though I didn't work directly with Mark, I got to meet with you and have your fingers involved with our programming on Elliott Street in Beverly. And then eventually I moved over to residential and oversaw the house that Mark lived in. And so we've been kind of close, working together throughout the year. So this has been a great chance for me to be able to sit and chat with you. We promised that we're going to share some stories today, but we're going to be nice to each other because we have stories that we could definitely have some fun and laugh at some of the things that we've done together throughout the years.
Okay.
So why don't you just start off by telling us about your involvement with the ARC and how you got involved in and why it was so important for you to join Northeast ARC at that time.
Okay. When Mark was born, we lived in Salem. And then when I was having my second child, we decided to move to Danvers. And so we lived on High Street in Danvers. And we had some neighbors that were not happy with us, and the boys were always beating up on Mark. So when Mark was about 4 or 5, he stopped talking for 2.5 years. He didn't talk at all. And it was because the boys were beating him up. So my husband was homesick with meningitis, and he saw for a month what was going on. And I said, we have to move. I can't live here anymore. When I talked to the mother about her boys, she said, if you put him in an institution where he belongs, there wouldn't be any problems in the neighborhood. I said, he's not a problem. Your boys are the problem. Well, she was not happy with me. So when Bud saw that happening, he said, yep, he went in the house and called a realtor, and we moved here.
Back when Mark was little, most people were told by their physicians and families to have their sons or daughters go into the institutions.
Well, that's why I had 3 different doctors. I kept letting them go because I kept saying, no, Mark's not going into an institution. And it was very difficult. And especially when you don't know who your friends are or what your relatives are thinking or what's happening. So when Eddie O'Keefe came to the house, he said, no, they have no right to take your son away from you. And that was the first time I heard somebody say something nice to me. And so he asked me if I would like to join the board, and I didn't know what a board was. And I said, yeah, it's a group of people. And that's where I met Carol Rayner. And I was really frightened at the board because I didn't know anybody there and got to know Carol very well. And the board was, you're there from like 7 to 12 o'clock, midnight, and Robert's rules were something I had never heard of. You had to raise your hand in order to speak. I have never done that. And so learning Robert's rules was very difficult. And but then I got to know Mike Goodstein and his wife Arlene, and got to know a lot of the people on the board I didn't get to know very well, because you only knew the people who were going to leave the board and work on a project. Like Carol and I worked on nursery schools, getting them built. And we worked on getting Hogan Regional Center built. It was called Hathorn State School then. And so we had a committee, we went to the State House to get the place built. And we went to Fernald State School to see what it was like, and it was disgusting. So we decided we're not going to put our kids away. And then when Hogan was built, Hathorn State School, which became Hogan, I think I was their first volunteer. And then I went to work there. When they built Hogan, they didn't include a kitchen, and all the food came from Danvers State. Well, when I was working there, we had food poisonings. And then one day, I was always getting in trouble. I'm sorry about that. But one day, the food came in. I was in charge of 20 girls here, and there were 20 boys there. And the food came from Danvers State, and I looked at it, and I says, we're not feeding the kids this. And so we pooled our money, and we brought food in, and Don Durkee gave us a case of marshmallow fluff. We made fluffing out of sandwiches, and we bought the kids cereal. And 2 days later, the head of nursing came over and said, do you know that there was food poisoning upstairs? And we had several patients in the hospital, and one died. And she said, and you had the same food. And the other two girls that helped me with this thing, they were scared to death they were going to get fired. And I said, we looked at the food and decided it wasn't for our kids, so we wouldn't feed it to them. And she never said anything. She just walked away. So, we didn't get food. We didn't get food poisoning.
So you're one to follow the rules. It sounds
I don't
like.
follow rules.
You've been known to make the rules up.
I do.
When you got involved with the ARC, Ed O'Keefe was the executive director.
Yes, he was wonderful.
And you wanted to start looking at doing some programming in the local community.
Joan Cole and Lenny Cole started the nursery school. It was at the Methodist Church. And I jumped into that and expanded it. And yeah.
So at that time, public schools did not have specialized programming.
No.
And so you guys went out and created your own nursery school.
Yes.
That would be able to be supportive of people living in
and Carol too. It was not just in Danvers, but there was one in Salem, and we had one in Lynn, and we had one at different places. Yeah, that's what we had to do. And then when they announced that they were looking into 766 was the chapter mandating that all children get an education. And when that started, that was like a nightmare in every community. And it started about the time that Hogan Regional Center was finished being built. And our agency was so involved that they invited us to the opening, and it was terrible. So things progressed, and one thing, they asked me if I would come in, because I lived in Danvers, and somehow they found out that I was doing volunteer work, and they asked me if I would come in a couple of days a week and talk to people in Danvers, parents in Danvers who wanted their kids in Hawthorne State School. And my job was to keep Danvers kids out because there was a school being built. So that was my job, and trying to talk to parents. Now I got parents mad at me. I was not doing well.
So the nursery schools you developed were developed before special ed.
Oh, yes.
Before 766.
Oh, yes.
How did you go from building the schools, the nursery schools and the churches, to then integrating the kids in the classrooms in the regular schools?
Okay, in Danvers, we were very, very fortunate. The school system was, well, most of the people were okay.
Back when Mark was young, you had the nursery school programs, but there was no other recreation or other programs for children who had disabilities.
Right.
You were instrumental for Northeast ARC and for the towns to introduce recreation programs.
Right.
Can you talk to us? That was one of our first programs as an organization, were the recreation programs.
Okay, let me tell you about recreation, okay? Yeah. In recreation, when in the beginning, all of the children were sent to Salem by cab. They were picked up at the house and sent to Salem. And then after a while, Salem didn't want them anymore. And they were sent to Beverly. The town manager, who was the town manager there, sent his son, who knew nothing about special needs, to Beverly. And Beverly, after a year or two, said, so-and-so isn't doing anything. He just sits there and the kids do nothing. we're not taking Danvers kids back. So here we are, and the town manager said, well, we have a school, the Williams School. It was an old yellow school with a dirt floor and a basement. The bathrooms were downstairs. And he says, and I have hired a 250-pound teacher who's going to carry the children downstairs to go to the bathroom. And I said, you are not. I said, it's not going to happen. And so we went to see, some of the parents went to the school, and we took a note. We said, we're not doing this. We went back to him and said, no, it's not going to happen. And he says, well, that's all I have. And so then he said, I have all their names and addresses, and I'm sending all the cabs to pick. And I says, the kids won't be there. They won't be home. He says, where will the kids be? And I says, out in front of town hall picketing you. And that's when he threw his hands in the air and he mumbled something. He didn't say anything. So then I went and I called the school psychologist, Dick Brownell, and I said, the kids don't have a place to go. Can we use the Riverside School? And he says, yes. Well, he called me back like 15 minutes later. He says, I got permission for you to do it. So we went there. And then after we went there, it was really very hot there. And so the town manager, Wayne, and Larry Crowley, they decided that we should go to the Endicott Park. Well, some of the town fathers were upset because they didn't want those kids to ruin the park, because that was but the Townleys who lived there said, yes, we want them there. After a year, Trudy Cullen came in. Now, Trudy, I worked with her at Hogan when she was in college. She came to Hogan, and she is one of the most great, she's the greatest person you ever want to meet. And she took the program, and she knew what the kids were learning in school, and so she brought a learning component into the playground, and it worked out excellent. And they got to go to the fireman's muster, and they were integrated. They had a float in the parade. They got to do everything the normal kids were doing, and it became noticed by a lot of people. And we had high school kids that came to volunteer, and so it worked out very, very well. And Trudy really developed that program so that the program was known across Massachusetts as being the best summer program in Danvers. And I don't think I made that up, but I'm not sure.
We'll just go with it, Barbara. I say at this point, you say it is, and every other town came out to you to learn from how you guys did it. Talk to me about how your relationship with Wayne started.
It started when he was a Boy Scout here. And when he came in, I was so delighted because he knew Mark, and he knew, the struggles we were having. And he came in at the same time as Larry Crowley, and Larry his first job was working in another state with special needs. So Wayne and Larry worked together on the special needs, all special needs people. And Wayne also asked me if I would join the board of directors of the recreation committee. And I was the only girl. And all they ever talked about was Little League and Little League fields and lights. And I was thrown in talking about special needs kids who didn't need a ball field. And so I wanted other things. And finally, most of them came across. They were really very good. But yeah, Wayne, I always had Mark with me wherever I went. And so whenever I went to town hall because I was on the recreation committee, Mark would be with me. So, and he would just sit there, and he would get up and walk around and talk to people. And one day I was looking for him and couldn't find him. And so I went out into the hallway, and Wayne's office was on the opposite end of town hall, up at the second floor. And I saw the secretary, and I said, Ann, have you seen Mark? Yeah, he's in with Wayne. He just walks in with Wayne. And so I went and I said, oh, Wayne, I'm so sorry. He goes, no, he can come in anytime. But he never knew Wayne by his car his name, he knew him by his mother's car. Mark knew everybody by their cars. He loved cars. And when he was 12, a friend of mine gave him a car from Ford's, an old one, and put it in the backyard so he could get out there and pretend to drive. And I said, one day I said to him, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Greenland." And I says, "Why are you going to Greenland?" He says, "I've never been to a hospital there before." And I says, "You're right, you haven't been to every other hospital, every other doctor." So he was really kind of funny. But yeah, Mark used to love to go to the gas station. And so one day he went out and took the hose, filled up.
Well, that must have been fun in this household.
So Bud's going to Salem, and all of a sudden the car dies. and it was because Mark filled the oil tank up with water. So anyway, but he was a challenge.
You had your hands full at times.
I did, with 3 little girls. The thing is, we were always battling somebody. If it wasn't the politicians, it was teachers. If it wasn't teachers, it was somebody else, and it was your relatives, and so you were never really sure about what you were doing. And Carol Rayner was doing the same thing in her neck of the woods, and in Peabody, what was her name?
Selma Michelman?
Huh?
Was it Selma Michelman?
Yes. And that poor girl, well, I'll have to tell you, Peabody did not do her well at all. The principal of the high school was very angry, and they took the kids and put them in a small room behind the principal's office, and the principal locked the doors when they came in. And here's the Danvers kids running all over the place. So I really felt bad for her, because Peabody was really very bad, and she was really very, very upset, and there wasn't very much we could do, and so I felt bad for her.
So part of what I'm hearing too is what you've done is you built some coalitions of like-minded people.
Yeah.
You and Carol Rayner became really close and good friends. You got introduced to Selma Michelman.
Yep.
And I know she had some other strong women with her as well.
Yes, she did, Mary Ann. And then there was a guy in Gloucester. And there were other people, the Michelmans were there. And I got to know them. There were just so many different things going on all at the same time. You know, building Hogan and getting 766 started, and getting the playgrounds going, and everything was going on. And then I told you we went to Fernald a couple of times to look it over. And then I was kind of upset. And then one day there was a small article in the paper, in the Salem News, about the parents at Fernald. And they had been asking for years for new mattresses that were, you know, urine and feces soaked. And politicians were saying, no, 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 no. They took a truck and they took the mattresses and they threw them on the State House floor. So if that's what you had to do, you know, that's what you had to do to call the attention to people, is throw urine-soaked mattresses on the State House floor. And I have to tell you, I love those parents.
Well, I mean, one of the things you guys had to do as parents and community leaders was not always accept what was given to you,
right,
and ask for the next thing.
Right.
So the nursery school, yes, the town was going to give you a nursery school, but the basement and the dirt floor and having a bathroom down there wasn't what you guys wanted. You had to advocate and fight for the better location.
Right.
Recreation programs, you got those, but they weren't set up for what you guys wanted for your
right.
children, and eventually you had to build it your own
right.
in Danvers. And it sounds like Danvers has been a great community.
Danvers was great because because the people in Danvers, starting from the town manager to Larry Crowley to the people at Endicott Park, everybody was so wonderful. And then when they brought in the volunteers from the high school, and then other people started coming in, the parents would come in to see what their kids were doing, and it just kind of evolved.
And our services in Massachusetts kind of changed as Mark was aging.
Yes.
And eventually, residential services came into play with you, and looking at that there was no community options for Mark to live outside of your house. And what were some of the things that you, and I know Carol was heavily involved with you.
Right. Well, I was on the committee that was looking at houses, and I went to the house in Peabody, Dr. Bradley's house. But when Mark was in high school, he had this wonderful teacher. His name was Frank, and he was very nice. And then he came to me one day and he says, "We have a plan for Mark. We want to move Mark from the Ark. Up on Liberty Street, there was a building that they were putting boys in that were like, I think they were trouble boys or something." And he says, "We're going to do," and he gave me a list of things that Mark was going to do, and they were going to make him normal. And I said to him, "I'm not leaving the Ark." And he said, "No, you don't understand. You really need to do this because then Mark won't need the Ark." And I said, "Mark is staying with the Ark." He was very upset. He says, "Well, when Mark was in the middle school, he was screaming and doing all kinds of stuff." And I said, "Why is he screaming?" And I said, "I'm coming to the school." So I marched my body down to the school. And I said, "Tell me what's going on." So they said, "Okay, we're going to show you." They took him into the auditorium. And they said, one of the things on Mark's list is that he has to jump off the stage. And I said, "What are you talking about? I won't jump off that stage." And I said, "Don't you know that Mark has delayed eye action? He has, he can't, that's why he can't cross the street, because he can't focus right away. He's not jumping off of there." And he said, "Well, that's on his list." I said, "Well, take it off the list." You know, and that's what they wanted him to do. So I had problems with some of the things that they were trying to make Mark do. With medication, I realized, because Mark was on behavior meds, that the meds that they were giving children, now that they were staying at home, were meds that they were giving to adults. They weren't, I don't think they had the right medications for kids.
There was no roadmap. You guys had to develop the roadmap.
Right.
I mean, I remember you telling me stories on you having to change doctors throughout the year.
3 times.
3 times, because the doctors that you had working with Mark didn't really fully understand where Mark was coming from and what his potential was, and were kind of not necessarily doing the best treatment plans for him. So you had to go in as his advocate, as his mom, and make those changes for him.
Right. But the other mothers did too. I mean, I didn't work alone. I mean, you know, we had some Danvers mothers were really good. There was a couple that weren't, but we got along. But it was, and part of the problem with colleges is they don't teach anything. There weren't any classes about how to take care of. So when Mark went into the Riverside School, it was a first grade teacher. They took kindergarten and first grade teachers because they didn't have special ed teachers. And so that was kind of an issue. And when Mark went to Pennsylvania, he learned to read, he learned to write. And I know a lot of people thought that program was crazy, but he learned a great deal. He did very well in that program. And we had a lot of the neighbors come in and help. And the patterning program, we took some of the neighborhood kids and threw them on the table to practice on the kids.
Let's switch and talk about opening up our first residential programs. You were heavily involved when...
Well, Peabody wasn't too bad. We made the young couple get married. We wouldn't hire people to live there as singles unless they were married.
So back in those days, just for some clarity around this, is that Northeast Ark wanted to develop houses for people who had disabilities to live in the community.
Yep.
That really wasn't happening anywhere in Massachusetts.
We were the first.
We were the first to do that.
I love being the first.
And each house had house parents.
Right.
And so there was an apartment or an area set up for the house parents.
There was a room, right.
And so that's what you're talking about.
Right.
Was the house parents
Yeah.
at the first house in Peabody.
Yeah.
You guys arranged a wedding for.
Yeah, and that was good. We took most of kids from institutions, other institutions, and one from the community. There was one from the community that the parents moved to Texas, and Mark was offered the spot, and I was shocked because we had just redone the house for him because the girls were off to college. Yeah, so the next house was the house that I almost got thrown in jail for.
Opening up the houses were not easy because it was new in the community. The neighbors didn't understand. It was new rules that Massachusetts
Well, the Salem
had.
house was different in that Mike Goodstein kept the house. I don't know how he kept it for a year and a half without something happened to it. He did that. But what happened was it was right across the street from Bud's folks. I grew up in that neighborhood. I grew up down the street. Now, the mayor, the guy that gets him, his campaign manager,
Okay.
lived next door. And the fence went right to the house. And he had two big dogs, and the dogs used to defecate right there so they couldn't open the window. But opening the house was absolutely horrible. The family across the street, they had girls, and they wanted us. They let us use their house to have all the neighbors come in. And the neighbors were very nice except for a few of them. And one of the neighbors had the guy that across the street, he lost his job. He was a cook in a nursing home in Marblehead, and because he was allowing in favor of the house, they had him fired. Our staff had to go and get his job back. But then they came down and they said, well, there's a rule. We told him about all the children that were coming in, and he says, well, there's a rule in the books that you can't have more than 3 unrelated people in a house. And I says, I grew up in this neighborhood, and when we moved out, my father took in some house, and I says, all up and down Linden Street and Forest Avenue, it's all these big houses, they all take in. So I says, do you mean we're going to have to go to the college and tell them they have to take all these students out of the neighborhood? That's the last I heard from them. I didn't have, and it's a good thing I lived in that neighborhood because otherwise I wouldn't have known that.
I remember you telling me stories of some of your family meetings with the neighborhoods. And there was one in particular you were invited to, and the meeting was held in the basement.
That's that house.
That's that
That
house.
was Salem, yeah. And there were so many people. I was they all sat on the stairs. There was no way for me to get out, and they were so angry. Carol was supposed to come, but she was sick, or her kids something happened, so I was alone. I got to tell you, that's the only time I think I feared for my life, because they were not happy with me at all. But then when they found out that they were just little kids, you know, they were like, I think Cindy was maybe 6 or 7, and they were all that age, and none of them were violent. They were just, Sally was the oldest, and she was 13. So yeah, that house was really difficult.
That experience in Salem, very different than in Peabody, but it's not so different than, opening up houses in other communities.
Oh no, they were all, the one in Peabody near Treadwell's Ice Cream, that one, boy, when we had a meeting, and I didn't go to the second meeting because the first meeting stressed me out so much, because all the politicians were like, they weren't nice at all. It was really very bad, and I had my fill of Salem. I didn't need to do this one again. So yeah, and we had, the other one we had was the one that they were going to make a bank out of, and the banks decided not to in Beverly, and we had two apartments, and they were for people in wheelchairs, and that was, we didn't have too many problems with that because it was across from the bank and across from the fire station, and so we didn't have too many problems with that, which was really good. So the one in Gloucester, we had some problems with that one. You know what happened in that one?
No, what?
Well, okay, at Hogan Regional Center. Do you remember Hop and Bod? There was a restaurant which is now Supino's.
Hop and Bod was well before my time in this area.
Right. So they said they were going to give our kids in our unit a party, a St. Patrick's Day party. So they had Donna and Elaine and all those kids. We got them all dressed up, and the buses were coming, and they were going to take. Psychiatrist comes over and says to Donna, "We're having your meeting. We want to see if you're fit to go to a group home." They took her out of line, and they had a meeting with her, and they came back and they said, "No, she's not. She can't go into a group home. And I said, "Why? What happened?" "Well, she was yelling and screaming and crying." And I said, "What did you do to her? You took her out of line. She's been institutionalized all her life. She's going to her first really big party. You take her out of line and you want her to be nice?" I said, "She's moving into Gloucester with Elaine." And then they said, "Well, she can't move in there because her family's from Medford and Elaine's family's from Lynn. And you have to go according to where you live." And so I went to the meeting and I says, "Make it work. She's going." And she went, and I yelled at those people. And it was like, they had all these people coming in making decisions that didn't know about anything. They didn't know what special needs people were like, and yet they were making decisions for special needs people, which really didn't go well with a lot of us.
So you guys been on the forefront. You guys, as a group, set up the nursery schools. You set up the recreations. You worked with the neighbors, set up residential programs. Families today really don't always know what you guys had to do to forge through and make these services that are available. When we were talking earlier, you had mentioned parents today walk into the nursery school and it's all set up. Special ed is functioning and happening. Over the past couple of years, we've seen some concerning developments with funding on the federal level. We've seen the gutting of the special ed department on the federal level. We've seen big cuts in Medicaid that will trickle down to the services that are providing for people today. Families today didn't have to go through what you guys went through. What is your recommendations to these younger families now as they're looking at the system going back in time?
Yeah, it was a cost of money, and in the very beginning, when the schools were setting up, and people were saying, "We can't afford it, we can't afford it, we can't afford it," and that was going on everywhere. And down in Connecticut, it was happening there too. And what happened was, which I think changed what happened in the country. They said, "Well, if we can't educate our children, we're going to eliminate the sports program." That happened in Connecticut. And so all of a sudden, they found the money. And they didn't have to take away the sports program. But that was like a threat. But it happened, and that's kind of snowballed. Yeah, and that was a concern, the money. But because they had never spent money before on special needs people, it was new to them and they didn't want to do it, and they didn't look at the money. I think Connecticut made a difference, and Danvers didn't. I don't recall Danvers having a major problem with it. I'm sure there was, because I know that because when they first moved in, it wasn't that much money. But once they put in an education program so that it wasn't just a babysitting classroom, they were actually learning things. They were learning to read and write. They were learning to be regular people, and then it costs money. and they didn't know where the money was coming from. So, and I understood that, and we all did. But on the other hand, my son is just as important as anybody else was. So,
Your advice to new families who are entering the system and the system is changing.
stay involved. Stay involved with the ARC. And if I hadn't had the ARC, I don't know what would have happened. But staying involved with the ARC made a difference in our lives. So when that guy came and wanted Mark to go to that other place, I'm like, nah, he's not going, staying with the ARC. But yeah, just you stay with the ARC and you stay in a group. You know, although all of us, you know, Carol and we were all doing individual things in our own city and towns, we worked as a group. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? How do I do this? Who do I see? You know, we worked as a group to make it happen, and it did happen that way. And even though individually we were causing chaos, we really were working as a group.
Well, in knowing all the people that you mentioned earlier, working with their kids over the years as well, each of the child had different needs
Yes.
and different supports. But the message I'm hearing is you guys were advocating for your child, but you were advocating also for the larger group.
Right. When we opened up the deaf homes, you know, that was very special. Yeah. So yeah.
But you guys looked beyond your child's needs.
Yes.
And you looked at the collective
The
groups.
collective group. Right.
Times are scary with budget cuts. We're hearing the R word come back into, you know, people's speech. At your point in your life, what keeps you hopeful that things won't go back to where they were?
Well, when Mark was born, the words were idiot, imbecile, moron. Retarded was a better word. And so, but once you got rid of those words, and they weren't allowed to be spoken anymore, so now and I was sitting at a board meeting, and we were doing some work when I was running the food pantry. Somebody wrote something to go into the computer, and they said they used the word retarded or something, and I said no, it is their children first, their name first. Mark is special needs, not I have a special needs child named Mark. He's first. His name is first, and then the description. And so I had the board change all the language in the board that you say the person's name first. And even at the pantry, they're not poor people. They're people in need. And so I made sure that, you know, you use the correct language. You don't use a derogatory adjective to describe.
Words matter. Words matter, and you're putting the human first and not what challenge they may or may not have at that moment. Mm-hmm. Well, Barbara, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me today. It was wonderful to hear you speak and share your memories and the journey that you've taken as a trailblazer for the ARC and for all people with disabilities throughout your years. We want to thank Peabody TV for recording this broadcast, and All Things Disability is made possible through the financial support of the Changing Lives Fund, which was created through a generous gift from Stephen Rosenthal. To learn more about the Northeast ARC and find past episodes of this podcast, please visit any-arc.org. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.